Hello, fellow explorer. I'm glad you found your way here. Welcome to Midnight Explorations, a quiet place for gentle journeys and deep rest. Tonight, we are going to embark together on an exploration of mountain summits, of first ascents, and of the human spirit drawn upward toward the sky. For the next little while, there's nothing for you to do and nowhere for you to go. Let the day fade into the distance and focus on getting comfortable and breathing deeply. The stories we will encounter tonight span centuries, from ancient times when mountains were seen as sacred dwelling places of gods, through to our modern era where technology and determination continue to push the boundaries of what climbers can achieve. But more than anything, these are stories of exploration, of curiosity, of that timeless human desire to see what lies beyond the next ridge, to stand where no one has stood before. Each peak has its own character, its own story to tell. Some mountains are gentle giants, their slopes rising gradually through forests and meadows before reaching snow-covered summits. Others are fierce and dramatic, with vertical walls of rock and ice that seem to defy gravity itself. Tonight, as you rest here in comfort and safety, you can let your imagination carry you to these high places without any of the effort or danger. You can experience the wonder and beauty of the mountains through the eyes of those who have explored them, who have pushed themselves to extraordinary limits in pursuit of summits and dreams. And as these stories unfold, one flowing into the next like a gentle stream descending from high glaciers, you may find your thoughts becoming softer, your body becoming heavier, your breath becoming slower and more rhythmic. This is exactly as it should be. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. Nothing else you need to think about or worry about. Just rest here and let the mountains welcome you into their timeless embrace. So close your eyes if you have not already done so. Feel the weight of your body supported completely by whatever surface holds you. Notice how your shoulders can drop just a little more, how your jaw can soften, how even your fingers and toes can release any tension they might be holding. We have all the time in the world tonight, so rest now and allow these stories to accompany you gently towards sleep. The mountains have been here for millions of years. They are patient, they are timeless, and tonight they invite us to explore their history at a pace that soothes rather than excites, that calms rather than stimulates. Think of how a mountain simply exists, unmoved by the passage of days and years, standing firm through countless sunrises and sunsets, through storms and clear skies, through all the changing seasons. In winter, they wear blankets of snow that sparkle in the moonlight. In spring, waterfalls cascade down their flanks as the snow begins to melt. In summer, wildflowers bloom in high meadows, painting the landscape with splashes of color. And in autumn, the alpine forests turn gold and crimson before the snow returns once more. This cycle has repeated for eons, and it will continue long after we are gone. There is something deeply peaceful about this timelessness, about the way mountains remind us that some things endure, that some things remain constant even as everything else changes. Long before mountaineering became a sport, before anyone thought to climb a mountain simply for the challenge and glory of it, peaks were seen as sacred places. In ancient times, mountains were often believed to be the homes of gods, places where the earthly and the divine met. Let your mind drift back through the centuries now, back more than 2,000 years, back to ancient Greece, where Mount Olympus rises majestically above the landscape, its summit often wreathed in clouds. To the ancient Greeks, this mountain was not just a geographical feature, but the very throne room of Zeus and the pantheon of gods. They believed that somewhere up there, far above the realm of mortals, the gods lived in magnificent palaces, feasting and debating and watching the affairs of humans below. Ordinary mortals rarely dared to venture onto its slopes, for this was holy ground, a place of power and mystery. The mountain itself seemed to reinforce this sense of the sacred. Its lower slopes were covered in dense forests of oak and beech, where shadows moved and strange sounds echoed. Higher up, the trees gave way to rocky terrain, and higher still, snow and ice made the upper reaches seem like another world entirely, cold and remote and forbidding. Yet even in those distant times, there were those whose curiosity overcame their fear. Around the 5th century before the Common Era, the poet Pindar wrote of Mount Olympus with a sense of familiarity. While there is no record of him ever reaching its higher slopes, later traditions imagined him wandering the lower reaches of the mountain. There would have been no trails, no guidebooks, no specialized equipment, just a man, his determination, and the wild, untamed slopes of a mountain that his culture believed housed the gods themselves. As he climbed higher, leaving the olive groves and settlements behind, the character of the landscape would have changed dramatically. The familiar world of villages and farms would have fallen away below him, replaced by wilderness. The air would have grown thinner and cooler with each step upward. Perhaps he followed game trails at first, paths worn by deer and mountain goats. Perhaps he found his own way, choosing his route carefully over rocky slopes and through steep ravines. The higher he climbed, the more the mountain would have revealed its true nature. What had seemed from below to be a single majestic peak would have resolved itself into multiple summits and ridges, a complex landscape of stone and snow. Did he wonder, as he climbed, if he might encounter Zeus or Athena on those lofty heights? Did he question the wisdom of his journey, worried that he might be trespassing on sacred ground? Or was he filled with a sense of wonder and adventure, excited to explore this realm that so few had entered? We can only imagine his thoughts, but we know that he made this pilgrimage, driven by something deep within the human spirit, the need to explore, to discover, to stand in places of beauty and grandeur. And when he reached high on the mountain, higher than most mortals had ever stood, what did he see? The world spread out below him, the Aegean Sea glittering in the distance, other mountains marching away to distant horizons, and above him, perhaps just clouds and rock and snow, or perhaps, in his mind's eye, the palaces of the gods themselves. As the centuries roll by and we move into the Middle Ages, mountains continue to hold a sacred significance, though the nature of that significance had changed with the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. Now, instead of being seen as homes of pagan gods, mountains became places of pilgrimage, locations where the faithful would journey to demonstrate their devotion and perhaps to feel closer to the Christian God. Picture now the rocky island of Mont Saint-Michel off the coast of France, rising from the sea with its medieval monastery, perched dramatically at the summit. This extraordinary place, where stone buildings seem to grow organically from the rock itself, has drawn pilgrims for more than 1,000 years. Imagine being one of those medieval pilgrims, making your way across the tidal flats at low tide, the vast expanse of sand and mud stretching away in all directions, the monastery looming larger with each step. You would need to time your journey carefully, for when the tide turns, it comes in swiftly across these flats, and more than one pilgrim has been caught by the rising waters. Reaching the island, you would begin the ascent through the medieval village that clusters around the base of the rock, climbing steep, narrow streets, passing under ancient arches, always moving upward toward the abbey above. The climb itself would be an act of devotion, each step a prayer, each breath an offering, and finally, reaching the top, entering the soaring spaces of the abbey church, you would feel that you had truly left the earthly world behind and entered a place closer to heaven. The view from the abbey walls, looking out over the sea and the distant mainland, would only reinforce this sense of having ascended to a different realm, a place between earth and sky. The Pyrenees too saw pilgrims walking ancient routes, climbing to reach sacred sites nestled among the peaks. These journeys could take days or weeks, following paths that wound through mountain valleys, crossed high passes, and descended again into new territories. Along the way, pilgrims would encounter other travelers, share stories and meals, find shelter in monasteries and simple mountain refuges. The mountains tested them physically, but they also offered moments of profound beauty and peace. A sunrise seen from a high pass, the stars impossibly bright in the thin mountain air, the silence of a snow-covered landscape. All of these experiences would become part of the pilgrim's spiritual journey. These were not climbers in the sense we understand today, but they were mountain explorers nonetheless, people drawn upward to high places for reasons of faith and devotion. And in the process, they learned the ways of the mountains, the importance of preparation and caution, the rewards of perseverance. Moving into the 16th century, we begin to see the first recorded ascents that were motivated more by curiosity and the spirit of exploration than by religious devotion. This was the age of the Renaissance, when Europe was rediscovering classical learning and developing new ways of thinking about the world. Artists were creating works of unprecedented beauty. Scientists were making discoveries that challenged old assumptions. Explorers were sailing to distant lands and returning with tales of wonders. There are scattered accounts of scholars and explorers venturing higher into the Alps than had been common before. The details of these journeys are fragmentary and debated, but they reflect a growing curiosity about mountains as places to be explored, rather than feared or revered from a distance. People were beginning to look at mountains differently. They were no longer just obstacles to be avoided or sacred spaces to be approached with fear and reverence. They were becoming puzzles to be solved, challenges to be met, places worthy of exploration for their own sake. Imagine what it must have been like to be among a group of explorers, setting out to climb a peak not because it was believed to house gods, not because a monastery crowned its summit, but simply because it was there, because they wanted to see what the view would be like, because they were curious about what they might discover. This represents a fundamental shift in how humans related to mountains, a shift that would accelerate in the centuries to come. Throughout the 1780s, interest in the Alps continued to grow and develop. English and Swiss naturalists made early explorations and ascents, driven by scientific curiosity, as much as by any desire for personal adventure or glory. These early scientist climbers would venture onto the glaciers and up the slopes, carrying barometers to measure altitude, thermometers to record temperatures at different elevations, notebooks to record their observations. They collected plant specimens from high altitudes, pressing flowers and preserving seeds, documenting which species could survive at which elevations. They studied rock formations, trying to understand the geology of the Alps, debating theories about how these great mountains had been formed. They made detailed observations of glaciers, those vast rivers of ice that flow slowly down from the high peaks. How fast did glaciers move? Did they advance and retreat over time? What caused the deep blue color visible in crevasses and ice caves? These naturalists would spend days and sometimes weeks in the mountains. camping in simple tents or finding shelter in shepherds' huts, enduring discomfort and sometimes danger in pursuit of knowledge. Their written accounts of these journeys helped to popularize the Alps among educated Europeans, creating an image of the mountains as places of sublime beauty and scientific interest. This was also the age when the concept of the sublime in nature became important in European thought. Philosophers and aestheticians began to write about the particular kind of beauty and emotional response evoked by wild, grand, and even terrifying natural scenes. Mountains, with their vast scales, their dramatic peaks and precipices, their power evident in avalanches and storms, became perfect examples of the sublime in nature. Artists began painting mountain scenes, though often they exaggerated the drama and danger, depicting peaks as more jagged and threatening than they really were. These paintings and the philosophical writings about the sublime helped to shift European attitudes toward mountains from seeing them primarily as dangerous obstacles to viewing them as sources of aesthetic pleasure and spiritual uplift. The stage was being set for the birth of mountaineering as we know it. All the pieces were coming together. There was growing scientific interest in mountains. There was aesthetic appreciation for mountain landscapes. There was improving technology in terms of equipment and clothing. And there were individuals who combined these interests with a spirit of adventure and a willingness to take risks in pursuit of their goals. All of this was building toward that pivotal moment when two French climbers, Balmat and Paccard, would make their historic ascent of Mont Blanc, the climb that would ignite the modern era of mountaineering and inspire generations of climbers to come. Let your mind drift now to the year 1786, to the Mont Blanc Massif, the highest mountain in the Alps. For years, people had looked at this massive peak and wondered if it was even possible for a human being to reach its summit. The mountain rises over 4,800 meters into the sky, its upper slopes covered in snow and ice year-round, its summit often shrouded in clouds. From the valley of Chamonix below, it dominates the landscape, a vast white pyramid that seems to touch the heavens. Many believed it simply could not be climbed, that the altitude was too great, the slopes too steep and dangerous, the cold too intense. But there were two men who thought otherwise. Jacques Balmat was a local guide and crystal hunter, someone who knew the mountain well from his time roaming its lower slopes in search of valuable minerals. He had spent years wandering the glaciers and ridges of the Mont Blanc Massif, studying its moods, learning to read the weather and the snow conditions. Michel Gabriel Paccard was a doctor from Chamonix with a keen interest in science and a determination to reach the summit. He wanted to make scientific observations from the highest point in Europe, to see what could be learned about altitude and its effects on the human body. Together, these two men, so different in background but united in their goal, planned an attempt on Mont Blanc. On the 8th of August in 1786, they set out on their historic climb. Imagine them in the pre-dawn darkness, the stars still bright overhead, the valley below them silent and still sleeping. They were carrying rudimentary equipment, wearing clothing that would seem impossibly inadequate to modern mountaineers. They had no crampons for their feet, no ice axes as we know them today, no ropes of modern synthetic materials, no lightweight tents or sleeping bags or stoves, just their courage, their determination, and their knowledge of the mountain. Balmat carried a long wooden pole with an iron tip, which served as a primitive ice axe and walking stick. They wore heavy woolen clothing, sturdy boots, and carried provisions of bread and cheese and wine. As the sun rose, painting the snow pink and gold, they began their ascent. The route led them up and across vast glaciers, their surfaces broken by crevasses that had to be carefully navigated around or jumped across. In some places, the snow was firm and made for good walking. In others, it was soft, and they sank in with each step, exhausting work at altitude. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner. Each breath brought less oxygen to their lungs. Their hearts pounded. Their legs grew heavy, muscles protesting the constant upward effort. The cold bit at their fingers and toes, and they had to stop periodically to restore circulation, swinging their arms and stamping their feet. But still, they climbed, step by step, hour by hour, rising through zones of rock and snow and ice. They passed landmarks that would become famous to later generations of climbers. They traversed steep slopes where a slip could mean a fatal fall. They encouraged each other when energy flagged, when doubt crept in, when the summit seemed impossibly far above. The mountain tested them in every way, but they persevered, driven by a determination that would not be denied. At last, after many grueling hours of climbing that tested every ounce of their strength and willpower, after pushing their bodies to limits they had never before approached, Balmat and Packard stood on the summit of Mont Blanc. They were the first human beings to stand at that spot, at the highest point in all of Europe. Around them, the Alps spread out in every direction, peak after peak marching away to distant horizons. The sky above was an intense blue, deeper than any blue they had seen from the valleys below. The air was bitterly cold, but utterly still. For a few precious moments, they stood there, two men alone at the top of their world, having achieved something that many had thought impossible. They did not stay long. The cold and the altitude made lingering dangerous, and they knew that the descent would be as challenging as the ascent, perhaps even more so, as fatigue and the psychological letdown after achieving their goal could make them careless. But as they began to make their way back down, they carried with them the knowledge that they had changed something fundamental. They had proven that even the highest peaks could be climbed, that with skill and determination and courage, humans could stand on top of the world. This moment, this achievement on that August day in 1786, is often cited as the beginning of modern mountaineering. It captured the public imagination in a way that previous climbs had not. Here was proof that even the highest peaks could be climbed, that with skill and determination and courage, humans could stand on top of the world. The ascent of Mont Blanc ignited a passion for alpine climbing that would only grow stronger in the decades to come. As we move forward in time from that historic first ascent of Mont Blanc, we enter what would become known as the Golden Age of Alpinism. This period, often defined by historians as spanning roughly 1854 to 1865, saw an explosion of interest in climbing the great peaks of the Alps. More and more people, particularly from Britain, where mountaineering clubs were being formed and climbing was becoming fashionable among the upper and middle classes, began to travel to the mountains in search of adventure and achievement. The Alpine Club, founded in London in 1857, became the world's first mountaineering club and helped to establish mountaineering as a legitimate sporting pursuit. Members would gather to share stories of their climbs, to exchange information about routes and conditions, to plan future expeditions. The club published journals documenting ascents and explorations, creating a body of knowledge that helped future climbers. Similar clubs were soon founded in other European countries, each contributing to the growing culture of mountaineering. Guides became professional during this era. Men who had grown up in the Alps, who knew the mountains intimately from childhood spent herding goats or hunting chamois, found that they could make a living guiding wealthy visitors up the peaks. The relationship between guide and client, often between a working-class local guide and an upper-class foreign climber, was complex, but often surprisingly egalitarian in the mountains. There, technical skill and mountain knowledge mattered more than social class. Many lifelong friendships were formed between guides and their clients, bonds forged in the shared challenges and dangers of the peaks. Techniques improved steadily during the Golden Age. Climbers developed better methods for moving on rock, for cutting steps in ice, for rope work and belaying. The equipment improved as well, though it would seem primitive by modern standards. Hemp ropes replaced simple cords. Better boots were designed. Ice axes evolved from simple alpenstock walking sticks into the recognizable tools with picks and adzes that could be used for cutting steps and for self-arrest on slopes. Each innovation made climbing safer and allowed climbers to attempt more difficult objectives. And one by one, the great peaks that had stood unconquered for millennia began to yield their summits to human ambition. There was a sense of discovery, of exploration, of being first to stand when no human had stood before. Each successful ascent was recorded and celebrated. Each new peak climbed meant one less major summit, remaining unclimbed. Climbers raced to be first on various peaks, though it was generally a gentlemanly competition, at least on the surface. What had once seemed impossible was becoming merely very difficult. What had been very difficult was becoming challenging but achievable with proper preparation and conditions. The early decades of the 19th century saw steady progress as climbers tackled increasingly difficult peaks. Each successful ascent brought new knowledge and new confidence. What had been very difficult was becoming challenging but achievable. The community of climbers was learning and growing together, sharing knowledge about routes and conditions and techniques. Information that had once been closely guarded was increasingly being shared through club meetings and published journals. Maps were being made, documenting the topography of the Alps in increasing detail. Climbers were naming features, establishing the vocabulary that would be used for generations. Ridges, faces, couloirs, all the terminology of mountaineering was being developed and standardized during this golden era. And all the while, there were still many unconquered peaks, still many summits that no human foot had touched, still many walls and ridges that awaited a first ascent. The Alps contained hundreds of significant peaks, and the Golden Age saw systematic exploration of this vast mountain range. Each season brought new achievements. Each summer, teams of climbers and guides would head to the mountains, attempting peaks that had never been climbed, or finding new routes on peaks that had already seen ascents by easier lines. In 1854, the Wetterhorn had its first ascent, marking one of the opening achievements of the Golden Age of alpinism. Then, in 1857, climbers turned their attention to one of the most iconic and recognizable peaks in all the Alps, the Matterhorn. This mountain, with its distinctive pyramidal shape, had become a symbol of alpine climbing. Rising on the border between Switzerland and Italy, it stands apart from the surrounding peaks, a lone sentinel of stone that seems to pierce the sky. Its steep faces and sharp ridges made it a formidable challenge. For years, climbers had attempted to find a route to its summit, but the mountain had rebuffed all efforts, earning a reputation as unconquerable. The race to make the first ascent of the Matterhorn became something of an obsession for several climbers during the 1850s and early 1860s. Among them was Edward Whymper, a British mountaineer who had been captivated by the peak from the moment he first saw it. Whymper was not originally a mountaineer at all, but an engraver and illustrator who had been sent to the Alps to make sketches of the mountains. But once he saw the Matterhorn, he became obsessed with climbing it. The mountain drew him back again and again, season after season. Whymper made multiple attempts on the Matterhorn, trying different routes, studying the mountain from every angle, learning its moods and challenges. He attempted it from the Italian side, from the Swiss side, always searching for a route that might unlock the summit. Each attempt taught him something new about the mountain and about himself. Each failure, rather than discouraging him, only strengthened his resolve. He assembled teams of guides and fellow climbers. He studied the rock and the ice. He waited for the right weather conditions, and he dreamed of being the first to stand on that famous summit. Finally, in July of 1865, Whymper assembled what he hoped would be the winning team, for what he prayed would be the successful attempt. The team included experienced climbers and some of the best guides in the Alps. Among them were Lord Francis Douglas, a young British nobleman and skilled climber, Charles Hudson and Douglas Haddo, both British mountaineers, and 3 experienced guides, including Michel Croz, who was considered one of the finest alpinists of his generation. They chose a route up what would become known as the Hernley Ridge, approaching from the Swiss side. This route, while still extremely challenging, seemed to offer the best chance of success. As they climbed higher on the 14th of July, their hopes grew. The route, while demanding every bit of their skill and concentration, seemed to be within their capabilities. The rock was steep but climbable. The weather held. As the hours passed and they gained altitude, the summit drew closer. And then, incredibly, after so many failed attempts by so many climbers, after the Matterhorn had rebuffed all challenges for so many years, they reached the top. Whymper and his team stood on the summit of the Matterhorn, realizing a dream that had consumed Whymper for years. That most iconic of peaks, that proud pyramid that had seemed unconquerable, had been climbed for the first time. For a few moments, there was pure elation. They had done it. They had achieved what so many said was impossible. They placed flags at the summit and shouted down to the Italian team that had been attempting the mountain from the other side, letting them know that the race was over, that the Matterhorn had been climbed. But the triumph was devastatingly short-lived. As the team began their descent, moving carefully down the same route they had climbed up, tragedy struck with horrible suddenness. Douglas Haddo, the least experienced member of the group, slipped on a patch of ice. He fell into Michel Croz, who was below him. The impact pulled Croz off his feet. The 2 falling men then pulled Lord Francis Douglas and Charles Hudson off the mountain as well. The 4 men, still roped together, plummeted down the north face. Whymper and the 2 remaining guides, higher up on the rope, were pulled toward the edge, about to be dragged to their deaths as well. But then the rope between them and the falling climbers broke. The 4 men fell approximately 1,200 meters down the mountain face to their deaths. Whymper and the 2 surviving guides, in a state of shock and horror, could only watch helplessly as their companions disappeared from view. The 3 survivors somehow found the strength and presence of mind to complete the descent, a descent that must have felt like a nightmare, made in a state of grief and trauma. The disaster shocked the mountaineering world and the public at large. Here was a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in this pursuit, of how quickly triumph could turn to tragedy in the high mountains. The deaths on the Matterhorn captured public fascination in a way that few mountaineering events had before. Newspapers across Europe wrote about it extensively, There were inquiries and investigations. Some called for an end to such dangerous pursuits, arguing that the lives lost were not worth the glory of reaching a summit. Queen Victoria herself was reported to have asked whether climbing could not be forbidden by law. But for the mountaineering community, while the tragedy was deeply and genuinely felt, while the loss of Michel Croz in particular was mourned as the death of one of the great alpinists of the age, it did not diminish the allure of the peaks. If anything, it reinforced the sense that these were serious undertakings, that the mountains demanded respect and skill and caution, that climbing was not a game but a genuine challenge with genuine consequences. The Golden Age continued. In 1862, the Dent Blanche was climbed for the first time. The Eiger, with its fearsome north face, began to attract serious attention during this period as well, although serious attempts on its north face would not begin until the early 20th century. But the attempts themselves were significant, representing a willingness to tackle increasingly difficult and dangerous objectives. The climbers of the Golden Age were not content merely to reach summits by the easiest roads. They sought out challenges, tested themselves against the mountain's most formidable defenses. By 1895, the Golden Age was coming to a close. Most of the major peaks in the Alps had seen successful ascents. The era of alpine first ascents was largely over, but this did not mean that mountaineering was finished. As we crossed the threshold into the 20th century, the world of mountaineering was about to expand dramatically. The Alps had been largely conquered. Climbers now set their sights on the greater ranges of the world, on mountains so tall and remote that they made even Mont Blanc seem modest by comparison. The Himalayas, that vast chain of mountains stretching across Asia, contained peaks that rose higher than anything in Europe. Among these giants was K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, rising over 8,600 meters into the sky on the border between Pakistan and China. This was a mountain of staggering size and difficulty, far more remote than the Alps, far more challenging in every way. In 1911, an Italian expedition led by Luigi Amedeo, the Duke of the Abruzzi, set out to attempt the first ascent of K2. The Duke was an experienced mountaineer and explorer who had already made his mark in polar exploration, having led an expedition that reached farther north than anyone before. Now he turned his attention to one of the most formidable mountains on the planet, drawn by the challenge and the allure of a peak that seemed almost impossibly difficult. The expedition faced enormous challenges from the very beginning. Simply reaching the mountain required weeks of difficult travel through remote terrain. From the nearest settlements, they had to organize a caravan of porters to carry their equipment and supplies across high passes and through deep valleys. The journey itself was an expedition in its own right, crossing landscapes of stark beauty and difficulty. Rivers had to be forded, glaciers crossed, high passes navigated. All of this before they even reached the base of the mountain they had come to climb. When they finally arrived at K2 and could see it in its full majesty, the challenge before them became clear. The mountain itself presented technical climbing challenges far beyond anything that had been attempted before at such altitude. K2 is not just high, it is steep. Its faces rise at extreme angles. Its ridges are knife-edge sharp. The rock is often loose and dangerous, and all of this at an altitude where the air is so thin that even simple tasks become exhausting. The Duke and his team were undaunted. They established base camp and began to explore possible routes. They acclimatized as best they could, though in those days the science of high-altitude acclimatization was not well understood. They climbed and descended, gaining height gradually, establishing camps higher and higher on the mountain. The Duke pioneered what would become known as the Abruzzi Spur, a route that follows a prominent ridge on the Pakistani side of the mountain. This line became the standard route on K2 and would be followed by many future expeditions. But despite their efforts, despite their skill and determination, despite the Duke's experience and the strength of his team, they could not reach the summit. The altitude was debilitating. The weather was harsh and unpredictable. The technical difficulties were extreme. At some point, they reached their limit, a high point on the mountain, but still far below the summit. The Duke made the difficult decision to turn back. But while they did not reach the summit, falling short of that ultimate goal, the reconnaissance and climbing they accomplished laid crucial groundwork for future attempts. They mapped the route. They learned about the conditions on the mountain. They discovered what worked and what did not at extreme altitude on extreme terrain. K2 would eventually be climbed, though not for many more decades, and when it was, those climbers would benefit from the knowledge gained by the Duke and his team. There is something to be learned here about how exploration often works, how one generation of explorers builds on the work of those who came before, how what seems like failure in the moment can actually be a crucial step toward eventual success. Each attempt, each push into the unknown, adds to our collective knowledge and brings us closer to achieving what once seemed impossible. The early 1920s saw the beginning of serious attempts on the world's highest peak, Mount Everest. This mountain, known to the Tibetans as Chomolungma, which means Mother Goddess of the World, and to the Nepalese as Sagarmatha, rises over 8,800 meters above sea level. It is the highest point on the Earth's surface, the ultimate mountaineering prize, a peak that had captured the imagination of climbers around the world. In 1921 and 1922, British reconnaissance expeditions travelled to Mount Everest to explore possible routes to the summit. These early expeditions were as much about exploration and mapping as they were about climbing. The climbers had to approach from the Tibetan side, as Nepal was closed to foreigners at that time. They mapped the approaches to the mountain, identified potential routes, and climbed high on the mountain slopes to test equipment and acclimatization strategies. George Mallory was part of both of these early reconnaissance expeditions, and it was during this time that he became intimately familiar with Everest, studying its ridges and faces, dreaming of reaching its summit. These expeditions laid the groundwork for future attempts, establishing base camp locations, identifying the route that would become standard, and learning valuable lessons about the challenges of climbing at extreme altitude. The experience gained during these reconnaissance years would prove crucial for the attempts that followed. In June of 1924, two British climbers, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, set out from their high camp on Everest in what everyone hoped would be a successful bid for the summit. Mallory was 37 years old, an experienced mountaineer who had been on two previous Everest expeditions. He had climbed higher on Everest than anyone at that point, had explored various possible routes, and was determined to reach the summit. He was famously quoted as saying, when asked why he wanted to climb Everest, "Because it is there," a phrase that has become emblematic of the mountaineering spirit, capturing in three simple words the essence of why people are drawn to climb, to explore, to push boundaries. Irvine was only 22, younger and less experienced than Mallory, but strong and determined. He was also mechanically minded and had been put in charge of the expedition's oxygen equipment, working to improve and maintain the primitive oxygen sets they were using. Mallory had chosen Irvine as his partner for the summit attempt, passing over more experienced climbers because he believed Irvine's youth and strength would be assets, and because Irvine's skill with the oxygen equipment might prove crucial. On the morning of June 8th, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp, located at just over 8,000 meters on the north ridge of Everest. They were carrying primitive oxygen equipment, heavy steel bottles filled with compressed oxygen, connected by rubber tubes to face masks. The whole system was cumbersome and unreliable, prone to freezing and leaking. They were wearing woolen clothing, leather boots with hobnails, primitive goggles. By modern standards, their equipment was laughably inadequate for the challenges they were about to face. But it was the best available at the time, and they had confidence in themselves and in each other. They climbed upward into the clouds, moving toward the summit. Another expedition member, Noel Odell, was below them in support. At around 12:50 in the afternoon, Odell saw them through a break in the clouds. They were high on the mountain, climbing strongly toward what is now known as the second step, a significant rock obstacle on the route to the summit. And then the clouds closed in again, and Mallory and Irvine were never seen alive again. What happened to them remains one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries, a question that has haunted the climbing community for decades. Did they reach the summit before they died? If so, they would have been the first humans to stand on top of the world, achieving the goal 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing. Or did they die on the way up, their summit attempt failing just short of success? Did they fall on the ascent or the descent? What exactly went wrong? For 75 years, these questions remained unanswered, the subject of endless speculation and debate. In 1999, a search expedition found Mallory's body on the mountain, preserved by the cold and dry air, lying face down on a slope at about 8,100 meters. The discovery answered some questions. The condition of the body, with a broken leg and rope marks suggesting a fall, indicated how Mallory had died. The fact that he had no photograph of his wife, which he had said he would leave on the summit if he reached it, suggested that perhaps he had not summited. But it also raised new questions. Where was Irvine? The two had been roped together, so Irvine should have fallen with Mallory, yet his body has never been found. And most tantalizingly, where was the camera they had been carrying? If that camera could be found, if the film inside could be developed, it might contain photographs that would prove whether or not they reached the summit. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. But what is not in question is the bravery and determination Mallory and Irvine showed, the willingness to push themselves to the very limits of human endurance in pursuit of a dream. Their story captured the public imagination and added to the mystique and allure of Everest. The mountain became more than just a geographical feature. It became a symbol of the ultimate challenge, the ultimate test of human will and capability. And climbers continued to attempt it, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had drawn Mallory and Irvine, each hoping to succeed where they had fallen short, or perhaps to match their achievement if they had indeed reached the summit. The decades following the Mallory and Irvine expedition saw continued attempts on the world's highest peaks, but progress was slow. The Great Depression and then the Second World War interrupted mountaineering expeditions. Equipment remained relatively primitive. Knowledge of high-altitude physiology was limited. Many thought that it might not even be possible for a human to survive at the summit of Everest, that the altitude was simply too great, the air too thin, the conditions too extreme. But as the war ended and the world began to rebuild, attention turned once again to the Himalayas, and to Everest in particular. As we move into the post-war era, we come to one of the most celebrated moments in all of mountaineering history. Though first, we must acknowledge an extraordinary achievement that came just before the conquest of Everest. In 1950, a French expedition achieved something that had never been done before in the history of mountaineering. Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenal reached the summit of Annapurna, becoming the first humans ever to stand atop an 8,000-meter peak. This was a watershed moment. Until this climb, no one knew for certain whether it was even possible for humans to survive and function well enough at such extreme altitudes to reach the summit of an 8,000er. The death zone, that realm above 8,000 meters where the human body slowly dies from lack of oxygen, was largely unknown territory. The French expedition to Annapurna in 1950 was a bold and ambitious undertaking. Annapurna, in the Nepalese Himalaya, was one of the lesser-known 8,000-meter peaks at the time, partly because Nepal had only recently opened to foreign mountaineers. The team had limited time and faced the challenge of not only climbing the mountain, but first finding and exploring possible routes. They reconnoitered several approaches before settling on the north face as their best option. The climb itself was grueling and dangerous. Herzog and Lachenal pushed to the summit on June 3, 1950, becoming the first people to stand above 8,000 meters on a mountain summit. But their triumph came at a terrible cost. The descent became a nightmare of frostbite, exhaustion, and near disaster. Herzog lost his gloves near the summit and suffered devastating frostbite to his hands. Both men suffered severe frostbite to their feet. Other team members were injured trying to get them down. Herzog would eventually lose all his fingers and toes. Lachenal lost all his toes. The suffering was immense, yet they had proven it could be done. An 8,000-meter peak could be climbed. This achievement opened the door for attempts on the other 14 8,000ers, including Everest. It gave climbers confidence that with proper preparation, acclimatization, and determination, these great peaks were within human reach. The sacrifice and suffering of Herzog and Lachenal, documented in Herzog's book Annapurna, became legendary in mountaineering circles, a testament to both the possibilities and the costs of extreme high-altitude climbing. In the years following the Second World War, there was a renewed focus on exploring and climbing the world's highest peaks. Technology had advanced during the war years. Better equipment was now available, developed from military research into cold weather gear and high-altitude flying. There was a better understanding of how to acclimatize to high altitudes, of how to use supplemental oxygen effectively, of how to organize large expeditions. Several nations mounted expeditions to major Himalayan peaks. The race was on to be the first to summit Everest, and it had become a matter of national pride, particularly for Britain, which had mounted numerous pre-war expeditions to the mountain. In 1953, a British expedition led by Colonel John Hunt set its sights on Everest. This was to be a meticulously planned and well-supplied effort, drawing on all the lessons learned from previous attempts. The team was strong, including many experienced climbers who had proven themselves in the Alps and on previous Himalayan expeditions. Among them were Edmund Hillary, a beekeeper and mountaineer from New Zealand, known for his strength and determination, and Tenzing Norgay, a Sherpa climber who had been on multiple previous Everest expeditions and who knew the mountain better than perhaps anyone alive. The expedition established a series of camps on the mountain, moving supplies higher and higher in the classic siege style that had been developed over decades of Himalayan climbing. Teams of climbers and Sherpas carried loads up from each camp to the next, slowly building up stockpiles of food, fuel, oxygen bottles, and equipment at higher and higher elevations. This was exhausting work, climbing with heavy loads in the thin air and then descending again, only to repeat the process the next day. But gradually, camp by camp, the expedition pushed its way up the mountain. They acclimatized carefully, spending time at each elevation to allow their bodies to adjust to the decreasing oxygen levels. They waited for weather windows, knowing that the summit attempt would require several days of stable conditions. As spring turned to early summer, as the monsoon season approached, the pressure mounted. They knew their window of opportunity was closing, but the team was ready. They had established camps all the way up to the South Col, the high saddle between Everest and Lhotse at over 8,000 meters. From there, they would make their summit attempt. 2 pairs of climbers would attempt the summit. The first pair, Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans, set out and climbed magnificently. Coming very close to the summit, they reached the south summit, only about 90 meters below the true summit, a higher point than any human had stood before. But they were exhausted, running low on oxygen, and facing deteriorating weather. They made the difficult but wise decision to turn back. Their attempt, while falling just short, proved that the summit was within reach and provided valuable information about the final section of the climb. Then it was time for the second team to make their attempt. On the 28th of May, Hillary and Tenzing established their high camp at about 8,500 meters, higher than anyone had ever camped before. They spent a miserable night in their small tent, buffeted by wind, struggling to melt snow for water and prepare some food in the thin air, where even simple tasks became exhausting. Neither man slept much. As dawn approached on the 29th of May, they prepared for their summit bid. The morning was clear and bitterly cold. They set out from their camp carrying oxygen equipment, cameras, and a few other essentials. Every movement required tremendous effort in the thin air. The route led them up a steep snow slope to the southeast ridge, and then along that ridge toward the summit. The climbing was technical in places, requiring careful footwork and balance on steep ground with enormous exposure. One slip could mean a fall of thousands of meters. At one point, they encountered a rock step about 12 meters high that seemed like it might block their way. This obstacle, which would later be named the Hillary Step in honor of the man who solved it, appeared very difficult. But Hillary found a route, chimneying up a crack between the rock and a cornice of ice. It was precarious and required every bit of his climbing skill, but he made it, and Tenzing followed. They were now very close to the summit, but they had learned from previous expeditions not to assume success until they were actually standing on top. They continued upward, step after exhausting step. The ridge narrowed, the slope steepened, and then at 11:30 in the morning on the 29th of May, 1953, they stood on the summit of Mount Everest. Hillary and Tenzing were on top of the world. For the first time in human history, people stood at the highest point on Earth's surface. Around them, the Himalayas stretched away in every direction, an ocean of peaks and glaciers. The sky above was a deep, intense blue. The air was so thin that even with supplemental oxygen, each breath was a struggle. They spent about 15 minutes on the summit. Hillary took a photograph of Tenzing holding his ice axe aloft, with flags attached to it, representing the United Nations, Britain, Nepal, and India. Tenzing left some offerings to the gods, chocolate and biscuits placed in the snow. Hillary left a crucifix that Hunt had given him. They took more photographs, proving they had reached the summit. And then, knowing that the descent would be as dangerous as the ascent, knowing that many climbers have died on the way down from summits, they began to make their way back down the mountain. The descent was painstaking and exhausting, but they made it safely back to their high camp, and then down to the South Col, where other team members were waiting. The news of their success was sent down the mountain by runner, as they had no radio communication from their position. It took time for the news to reach the world, transmitted from base camp via a runner to the nearest telegraph station, and then around the globe. But when it did, it electrified the world. It coincided with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and in Britain it was seen as a fitting symbol of a new Elizabethan age. Hillary and Tenzing became instant celebrities, heroes whose achievements seemed to prove that human courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. For mountaineers, the first ascent of Everest was a watershed moment. The highest peak had been climbed. What once seemed impossible was now proven achievable. This opened the floodgates for further Himalayan exploration and attempts on other 8,000-meter peaks. There is something deeply inspiring about the Hillary and Tenzing story. Two men from very different backgrounds working together as a team, achieving something remarkable through mutual support and shared determination. Tenzing had been high on Everest multiple times before, but had never reached the summit. Hillary brought technical skill and that particular New Zealand brand of pragmatic determination. Together, they succeeded where so many others had failed. As you rest here tonight, perhaps you can draw inspiration from their partnership, from the way they supported each other through the most challenging moments. Let the image of them standing together on that summit, on top of the world, be a peaceful and inspiring thought to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. The successful ascent of Everest was followed just a year later by another monumental achievement in the Karakoram. In 1954, an Italian expedition finally succeeded where the Duke of the Abruzzi had pioneered the route decades earlier. On July the 31st, Achille Compagnoni and Lino Lesedelli reached the summit of K2, the second highest mountain on Earth and arguably the most difficult of all the 8,000-meter peaks. This was a triumph for Italian mountaineering, connecting back to the Duke of the Abruzzi's pioneering work on the mountain in 1911. The route the Duke had explored, the Abruzzi Spur, became the pathway to success for this expedition. The climb was extraordinarily difficult, pushing the limits of what climbers could endure. K2 is steeper than Everest, more technical, more prone to severe weather. The summit day was a desperate push, with Compagnoni and Lacedelli climbing far later into the day than was safe, finally reaching the top in the early evening. Like the Annapurna climb 4 years earlier, the descent was harrowing. The two climbers spent a brutal night in the open at over 8,000 meters, surviving conditions that by all rights should have killed them. They suffered severe frostbite, but made it down alive. The successful ascent of K2, coming so soon after Everest, demonstrated that the era of first ascents of the 8,000ers was in full swing. These great peaks, once thought possibly beyond human capability, were yielding one by one to skilled and determined climbers. The era that might be called the golden age of Himalayan climbing had well and truly begun. Throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s, mountaineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the high mountains. New peaks were climbed for the first time. New routes were established on peaks that had already seen ascents, often more difficult routes that required greater technical skill. Climbers began to tackle mountains in winter, when conditions were far more severe than during the traditional spring and autumn climbing seasons. The standards of difficulty climbed steadily upward as techniques improved, as equipment got better, and as climbers learned more about how to function at extreme altitudes. These were decades of remarkable achievement, of barriers broken and new standards set. The 14 8,000-meter peaks, those giants of the Himalaya and Karakoram that rise above the so-called death zone where the human body cannot survive indefinitely, became the focus of intense effort. One by one, they received their first ascents. Climbers from many nations participated in this great age of exploration. The Italians were particularly active, as were the British, the French, the Germans, and increasingly the Americans and the Japanese. And through it all, the Sherpa people of Nepal proved themselves indispensable, serving as high-altitude porters, guides, and full expedition members, their intimate knowledge of the mountains and their extraordinary abilities at altitude making many expeditions possible. In 1957, the world of high-altitude mountaineering mourned the loss and celebrated the legacy of Hermann Buhl, an Austrian climber who had already achieved legendary status. Buhl was known for his remarkable solo ascent of Nanga Parbat in 1953, just weeks after the first ascent of Everest. Nanga Parbat, the 9th highest mountain in the world, located in Pakistan, is one of the most dangerous 8,000-meter peaks. Its nickname, the Killer Mountain, reflects its high fatality rate. Buhl's ascent was a remarkable achievement that showcased both his technical skill and his extraordinary endurance and mental toughness. The story of that ascent has become legendary in mountaineering circles. Buhl was part of a larger German-Austrian expedition to Nanga Parbat. But when the time came for a summit attempt, he set out alone, making a solo push for the top. He left camp in the early morning and climbed all through the day. The technical difficulties were significant. The altitude was debilitating, but he persevered, driven by an inner fire that refused to be extinguished. As evening approached, he was still climbing, racing against the setting sun. Finally, at 7 in the evening, after climbing for 17 hours straight, he reached the summit of Nanga Parbat. He was the first person to stand on that feared peak, but his ordeal was far from over. It was too late, and he was too exhausted to descend that night. He had no tent, no sleeping bag, no bivouac equipment. He was at over 8,000 meters with night falling. By all rights, he should have frozen to death, but somehow, standing upright through the night because sitting down would have been fatal, moving constantly to maintain circulation, Buhl survived the night. With the dawn, he began his descent, climbing down on frozen feet, eventually stumbling into camp to the amazement of his teammates who had given him up for dead. His fingers and toes were badly frostbitten, and he would lose several toes, but he was alive, and he had climbed Nanga Parbat. This achievement established Buhl as one of the great mountaineers of his generation, a climber of exceptional ability and determination. Tragically, in 1957, Buhl was killed in a fall while climbing on Chogolisa in the Karakoram. But his legacy lived on, inspiring future generations of climbers to push their limits, to attempt what seemed impossible. In 1963, an American expedition to Everest achieved something that many consider one of the greatest accomplishments in Himalayan mountaineering history. While one team successfully climbed Everest by the standard route, two other members of the expedition, Tom Hornbein and Willy Unsold, attempted a bold new route up the west ridge of Everest, a line that had never been climbed and that presented far greater technical difficulties than the normal route. Hornbein and Unsold succeeded in climbing the West Ridge, reaching the summit on May 22, 1963. But rather than descending the way they had come, which would have meant a dangerous descent of the difficult route in deteriorating weather and fading light, they made the audacious decision to traverse the mountain, descending by the standard South Col route on the opposite side. This meant they had to continue climbing over the summit and down unfamiliar terrain in the dark at extreme altitude with limited equipment. The traverse became epic. They ran out of oxygen. Night fell while they were still high on the mountain. They encountered the other team descending from their own summit climb, and the four climbers continued down together, finally bivouacking in the open at over 8,700 meters, one of the highest bivouacs ever. Miraculously, all four survived the night and made it down the next day, though with frostbite injuries. The West Ridge climb and subsequent traverse is still considered one of the boldest and most impressive climbs in Everest's history, demonstrating that even on a mountain that had been climbed many times, there were still new challenges, new routes, new ways to test the limits of human capability. In 1964, attention in the Alps turned to one of the most famous and feared climbs in that range, the north face of the Eiger. This vast wall of rock and ice had claimed many lives over the years. It was a climb that demanded not only technical excellence, but also speed, good judgment about conditions, and a fair measure of good fortune. Swiss climbers, including legendary figures in alpine climbing, tackled the American route on this fearsome face, adding another chapter to the Eiger's storied history. The north face of the Eiger had become a kind of proving ground, a test piece that separated the truly elite climbers from the merely very good. The 1970s brought new milestones and new barriers broken. In 1970, a British expedition led by Chris Bonington achieved the first ascent of the south face of Annapurna. Then, in 1975, a barrier of a different kind was broken, one that was social rather than physical, but no less significant for that. Junko Tabei, a Japanese climber, became the first woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest. In a sport that had been almost exclusively male, dominated up to that point, where women climbers were often dismissed or discouraged, where many believed that women simply were not capable of extreme high altitude climbing. Tabei's achievement was groundbreaking. Tabei had begun climbing as a young woman in Japan, joining climbing clubs and developing her skills on Japanese mountains. She had faced skepticism and discouragement from the start. Male climbers often did not take her seriously. Expedition leaders were reluctant to include women in their teams. But Tabei persisted, driven by her love of mountains and her determination to climb. She eventually founded the Ladies Climbing Club, an organization of Japanese women climbers who supported each other in pursuing their mountaineering goals. In 1975, Tabei joined a Japanese women's expedition to Everest. This was a significant undertaking, requiring years of preparation and fundraising. The team faced not only the physical challenges of the mountain, but also the burden of having to prove themselves in a male-dominated sport. They were under intense scrutiny. Many people, even in the climbing community, doubted whether a team of women could succeed on Everest. The expedition established camps on the mountain, following the standard route from the south side. They acclimatized, carried loads, did all the hard work of a Himalayan expedition. And then disaster nearly struck. An avalanche hit their camp too, burying Tabei and several other team members. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the expedition might end in tragedy. But the team managed to dig themselves out. and miraculously, no one was seriously injured. After recovering from this close call, they decided to continue. On May 16, 1975, Tabei and her Sherpa guide Mountaineering reached the summit of Everest. She was the first woman to stand at the highest point on Earth. The achievement was enormous, not just for Tabei personally, but for women in mountaineering everywhere. She had proven that women could climb at the highest levels, that the 8,000-meter peaks were not exclusively male domains. Her success paved the way for countless other women climbers and helped to begin shifting the culture of mountaineering toward greater inclusivity. Tabei did not stop with Everest. She would go on to become the first woman to climb the highest peak on each of the 7 continents, the 7 summits. She climbed well into her 70s, always advocating for environmental protection of mountain areas and for greater opportunities for women in climbing. Her legacy extends far beyond her own achievements. She showed that barriers based on gender were artificial, that they existed in people's minds and in social structures, but not in actual capability. She reminded everyone that mountains do not care about the gender of those who climb them, only about their skill, their preparation, their determination. Tabei's achievement reminds us that barriers are made to be broken, that assumptions about what is possible for any group of people are often based more on prejudice than on reality. And it reminds us that sometimes the most significant climbs are not just physical but social, breaking down barriers and opening up possibilities for future generations. The 1970s saw climbers beginning to seriously tackle the 8,000-meter peaks in winter. Winter climbing in the Himalayas is exponentially more difficult than climbing in the traditional spring or fall seasons. Temperatures are far lower, winds are stronger, daylight hours shorter. The risks of frostbite and hypothermia multiply. Early winter attempts on K2 advanced high-altitude tactics, though no winter ascent was made. These efforts followed in the footsteps of one of the most influential figures in modern alpinism, Walter Bonatti of Italy. Known for bold solo ascents in the Alps, groundbreaking climbs on the Grandes Jorasses and the Matterhorn, and his role in the 1954 K2 expedition, Bonatti helped redefine modern climbing standards. His reputation for self-reliance and technical mastery shaped the generations that followed, even if he was no longer leading such attempts himself. Bonatti's legacy lies in style and ethics, not a winter summit. Yet his example proved that even in the harshest conditions, with skill and determination, these great peaks could be approached. By this point, he was already a legend, a climber whose brilliance reshaped what the mountains demanded. The 1970s and 80s also saw the emergence of perhaps the most accomplished high-altitude climber in history. Reinhold Messner, an Italian mountaineer from the South Tyrol, began to redefine what was possible in the Himalayas. In 1978, Messner and Peter Habeler achieved something that many physiologists had believed was impossible. They climbed Mount Everest without using supplemental oxygen. At the summit of Everest, where the air pressure is only about a third of what it is at sea level, they relied solely on their own lungs and cardiovascular systems to extract enough oxygen from the thin air to survive and function. This ascent challenged long-held assumptions about human limits at extreme altitude. Most climbers had believed that supplemental oxygen was necessary to reach the summit of Everest and survive. Messner and Habeler proved otherwise, though they pushed themselves to the very edge of what their bodies could endure. The achievement opened up new possibilities for alpine-style climbing in the Himalayas, where climbers could move fast and light without the burden of heavy oxygen equipment. but Messner was not finished. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he systematically climbed all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, becoming the first person to accomplish this feat. In 1980, Messner returned to Everest for an even more audacious achievement: the first solo ascent of the mountain without supplemental oxygen. This climb, completed during the monsoon season when most climbers avoid Everest, was a landmark in alpine-style philosophy. Messner climbed alone, carrying everything he needed, relying entirely on his own strength and judgment. He reached the summit on August 20th, 1980, having spent 3 days climbing the North Face completely alone at altitudes where most people cannot survive. This solo ascent without oxygen represented the purest expression of alpine-style climbing on the world's highest peak, demonstrating that with exceptional skill and preparation, a climber could succeed on Everest with minimal support and equipment. He made first ascents of new routes on several 8,000ers. His accomplishments were not just about collecting summits, but about pushing the style and ethics of Himalayan climbing forward, advocating for lightweight alpine-style ascents rather than heavy siege-style expeditions. By 1986, when Messner summited his 14th 8,000er, Lhotse, he'd established himself as one of the defining figures in mountaineering history. His accomplishments inspired a generation of climbers to attempt the 8,000ers and to do so in lighter, faster, more ethical styles. The race to climb all 14 8,000ers became a significant goal in high-altitude mountaineering, with other climbers following in Messner's footsteps over the subsequent decades. Also in 1986, Jerzy Kukuczka and Tadeusz Piotrowski completed the first ascent of the south face of K2, the Polish line, during the summer season. It was one of the most committing alpine-style ascents ever achieved on an 8,000er. However, tragedy struck, and Piotrowski fell during the descent. In 1987, Polish climbers achieved the first winter ascent of Annapurna, continuing their remarkable tradition of Himalayan winter mountaineering. This was another milestone in winter high-altitude climbing, further establishing new standards for what was possible in the harshest conditions. The Polish climbers had developed techniques and equipment specifically suited to winter Himalayan climbing, and their successes throughout the 80s and 90s set benchmarks that other climbers aspired to match. The 1990s brought both triumph and tragedy to the world of mountaineering, and no event illustrated this duality more starkly than the disaster that occurred on Everest in 1996. The decade had seen increased commercialization of high-altitude climbing, particularly on Everest. Guiding companies had begun offering wealthy clients the opportunity to attempt the highest peak, supported by professional guides and experienced high-altitude workers, mostly Sherpas. For a significant fee, people with relatively limited climbing experience could join an expedition to Everest, with the guides handling much of the technical work and decision-making. This democratization of Everest was controversial from the start. Some felt it cheapened the achievement, that Everest was becoming a tourist destination rather than a serious mountaineering objective, that people were buying their way onto the summit rather than earning it through years of developing climbing skills. Others argued that more people getting the opportunity to experience these mountains was a positive development, that mountaineering should not be the exclusive province of elite athletes, and that everyone should have the chance to challenge themselves in the high mountains if they were willing to make the effort and accept the risks. Regardless of one's position in this debate, the increase in commercial expeditions brought more people to Everest than ever before, with multiple teams often attempting the summit on the same days, creating crowding on the routes. In May of 1996, this trend toward commercial expeditions had tragic consequences that shocked the world and the mountaineering community. The spring climbing season had seen unusually good weather, and multiple expeditions were poised to make summit attempts. On the 10th of May, several commercial expeditions and independent teams attempted the summit on the same day. The route was crowded with climbers, causing delays at difficult sections where only one person could climb at a time. Many climbers reached the summit that day, fulfilling dreams they had held for years. But the delays meant that many people were summiting later than planned, later than was safe. An old mountaineering rule of thumb says that you should turn around by a certain time regardless of how close you are to the summit, because you need enough daylight and energy to get back down safely. Many climbers that day, caught up in summit fever, ignored this rule, or the guides failed to enforce it. And then the weather, which had been relatively stable, suddenly deteriorated. A severe storm struck Everest with little warning. Visibility dropped to near zero in blowing snow. The temperature plummeted. The wind increased to dangerous levels. Climbers who had been making their way down from the summit found themselves lost in a whiteout, unable to see more than a few meters, unsure of which direction to go. Some were experienced mountaineers who had climbed many peaks. Others were relative novices whose lack of experience now became a deadly liability. In the chaos and brutal conditions that followed, 8 climbers died. Among them were Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, both highly experienced guides running commercial expeditions. Both were strong climbers who had summited Everest multiple times before. Also killed were clients who had paid large sums for the opportunity to attempt the summit, as well as independent climbers. The deaths occurred from various causes: exposure to the cold, falls, altitude sickness. But the underlying factors were similar across cases. Too many people attempting the summit on the same day. Delays that meant climbers were still high on the mountain when the storm hit, and perhaps commercial pressures that influenced decision-making. The disaster highlighted many issues that had been building in Everest climbing. The dangers of crowding on the mountain became evident, with too many people trying to use the same routes on the same days. The problem of fixed schedules and commercial pressures was exposed, when guides might feel pressure to get their clients to the summit, even when conditions were marginal, because clients had paid so much and might not have another opportunity. The ethics of commercial guiding on extreme peaks came into question, whether it was appropriate to bring relatively inexperienced climbers into such dangerous environments, whether the financial rewards were worth the human costs. The disaster also raised fundamental questions about decision-making in the death zone, that altitude above 8,000 meters where the human body is slowly dying, where judgment is impaired by lack of oxygen, where every hour spent there increases the risk. Even expertise and experience cannot completely eliminate the risks inherent in high-altitude mountaineering. Several of the deaths occurred among highly experienced climbers and guides, demonstrating that Everest can kill anyone, regardless of skill level, if conditions turn bad and decisions go wrong. The tragedy was extensively covered by the media around the world. News reports brought the story into homes and sparked widespread public interest in Everest and mountaineering. Several of the dead and some of the survivors had been in satellite phone contact with people back home during the disaster, adding a particularly poignant dimension to the story. Books were written about the event, most notably John Krakauer's best-selling Into Thin Air, which provided a detailed and at times controversial account of what happened. The book brought mountaineering to the attention of a wider public than ever before, and sparked important discussions within the climbing community about ethics, commercialization, and safety. But despite the tragedy, despite the deaths, and the soul-searching and the criticism, people did not stop attempting Everest. If anything, interest in the mountain continued to grow in the years that followed. The disaster became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can go wrong, but it did not deter those who dreamed of standing on top of the world. Everest continued to call, as it always had, as it always would. As the calendar turned to the year 2000 and we entered a new millennium, mountaineering continued to evolve in response to new challenges and new awareness. The rise of adventure tourism brought more and more climbers to popular peaks, and this trend accelerated throughout the 2000s and 2010s. This had both positive and negative effects that the climbing community began to grapple with seriously. On the positive side, more people than ever before were experiencing the mountains, were challenging themselves, were gaining the perspective and sense of achievement that comes from climbing. The mountains were no longer the exclusive province of wealthy Europeans and Americans. Climbers from many nations, from many economic backgrounds, were attempting peaks that had once seemed accessible only to an elite few. This democratization meant that mountaineering was becoming more diverse, more inclusive, bringing in new perspectives and new voices. But the increased traffic also raised serious concerns about overcrowding and environmental impact. Nowhere was this more evident than on Mount Everest itself. By the early 2000s, there were seasons when hundreds of people attempted the summit, with climbers sometimes waiting in long queues at difficult sections of the route, standing in the death zone for hours, while others ahead of them slowly made their way past bottlenecks. This crowding increased risk for everyone. It led to dangerous situations where climbers were stuck at altitude, burning through their limited oxygen supplies while waiting. The environmental impact of this increased traffic became a major focus of concern and action. Mount Everest was accumulating trash at an alarming rate. Abandoned tents, torn apart by wind over the years, littered the camps. Oxygen bottles, each weighing several kilograms and difficult to carry back down, were left behind by the hundreds. Food packaging, fuel canisters, broken equipment, all of it was accumulating on the mountain. Even human waste was becoming a problem, as climbers left it behind rather than dealing with it properly in the difficult high-altitude environment. Images of trash on Everest began to circulate in the media, showing the world's highest mountain littered with the detritus of human ambition. This sparked outrage and embarrassment. The mountains, which had always been symbols of pristine wilderness, of nature in its most powerful and pure form, were being degraded by the very people who claimed to love them. It became clear that something had to change, that the mountaineering community and the governments of Nepal and Tibet needed to take action to protect these precious environments. The Nepalese government and various mountaineering organizations began to implement regulations and cleanup efforts to try to preserve the mountain environment. Climbers were required to bring back a certain amount of trash, not just their own, but trash left by previous expeditions. Deposits were required from expeditions, which would be refunded only if they could prove they had cleaned up their campsites and brought down their waste. Organized cleanup expeditions, often led by Sherpas, went up to collect trash from the mountain, dangerous and difficult work at extreme altitude. Slowly, attitudes began to shift toward greater environmental responsibility. Climbers were encouraged to pack out all their trash, to leave no trace of their passage. Some expeditions began bringing portable toilet systems to high camps, rather than leaving human waste behind. There was growing awareness that these mountains, while vast and powerful, were also fragile ecosystems that could be damaged by careless human activity. The idea of leave no trace, which had become standard in lower altitude wilderness areas, was being applied to the Great Peaks. This environmental awareness extended beyond just trash. There was growing concern about the impact of climate change on the mountains themselves. Glaciers that had existed for thousands of years were retreating rapidly. Ice that had been stable was becoming unpredictable. Routes that had been used for decades were becoming more dangerous as climate change altered the mountain environments. The icefall on Everest, always one of the most dangerous sections of the standard route, was becoming even more unstable as warmer temperatures made the ice more prone to collapse. Climbers were witnessing these changes firsthand, seeing year by year how the mountains were being affected by global climate patterns. Many became advocates for environmental protection and climate action, using their platforms to raise awareness about the changes they were seeing. The mountains, which had always seemed eternal and unchanging, were revealing themselves to be vulnerable to human activity on a global scale. The 2010s brought new challenges and new conversations to the mountaineering world. Environmental concerns remained at the forefront. In 2010, there was increased focus on the impact of tourism on Everest and other popular peaks. Initiatives aimed at reducing waste and preserving mountain ecosystems gained momentum. The climbing community was beginning to grapple seriously with the question of how to pursue this activity in a sustainable way. How to allow people to experience the mountains without loving them to death. But the 2010s also saw the rise of a new style of climbing that pushed the boundaries of speed and difficulty in the mountains. Uli Steck, a Swiss climber known as the Swiss Machine, became famous for his incredibly fast solo ascents of some of the most challenging routes in the Alps and the Himalayas. Steck represented a new generation of climbers who combined exceptional fitness, technical skill, and an almost superhuman ability to move quickly and efficiently in the mountains. In 2008, Steck set a speed record on the Eiger North Face, completing the climb in just 2 hours and 47 minutes, a route that had once taken climbers several days. He continued to push speed climbing to new levels throughout the 2000s and 2010s, soloing difficult alpine routes in times that seemed barely possible. His philosophy was about moving light and fast, spending as little time as possible exposed to objective dangers like rockfall and avalanches. Steck turned his attention to the Himalayas as well, attempting audacious solo climbs and new routes on 8,000-meter peaks. In 2013, he made headlines with a controversial encounter on Everest, where a disagreement with Sherpas fixing ropes on the Lhotse face highlighted tensions between different approaches to climbing the mountain. But he continued pursuing his vision of alpine-style climbing in the Himalayas, planning a traverse of Everest and Lhotse without supplemental oxygen. In 2014, tragedy struck Everest again. An avalanche during the climbing season killed 16 Sherpas who were working to support various expeditions. This incident raised awareness about the risks faced by local guides and porters, the people who make high-altitude climbing possible for foreign climbers, but who often receive inadequate compensation and recognition for the dangers they face. The tragedy sparked discussions about safety, about fair treatment and compensation for high-altitude workers, about the ethics of an industry where Sherpas bore disproportionate risks. During the following year, 2015, climbers continued to attempt ambitious lines on the most formidable faces in the Himalaya, including renewed efforts on Annapurna's south face, undertakings that underscored how modern skill and equipment were pushing into ever more serious terrain. This showcased the increasing technical skill and determination of modern climbers. As techniques improved, as equipment got better, as climbers learned more about training and acclimatization and nutrition, the standards of what was considered possible continued to rise. Routes that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations were being accomplished, but the fundamental challenges remained the same. The altitude, the cold, the objective dangers, the need for good judgment and decision-making in extreme conditions. Tragically, in April of 2017, Ueli Steck died in an accident on Nupse while acclimatizing for his planned Everest Lhotse traverse. He was only 40 years old. His death was mourned throughout the climbing world. Steck had inspired a generation of climbers with his speed ascents and his commitment to climbing mountains in the purest possible style. His legacy lives on in the climbers who continue to push for fast, light, alpine-style ascents in the Great Ranges. And then, in 2019, the mountaineering world witnessed something extraordinary that redefined what was thought possible in high-altitude climbing. Nirmal Purja, known as Nimsdai, a former Gurkha soldier and British Special Forces member from Nepal, set out to climb all 14 8,000-meter peaks in a single year. Previous climbers had taken years or even decades to complete this challenge. Reinhold Messner had taken 16 years. The fastest time before Nimsdai's attempt was just under 8 years, but Nimsdai believed it could be done in just 7 months. His project, called Project Possible, began in April of 2019 when he summited Annapurna. Over the following months, Nimsdai moved from peak to peak at an astonishing pace, often climbing multiple 8,000ers in a matter of days or weeks. He summited all 5 8,000ers in Pakistan in just 23 days. He dealt with enormous logistical challenges, coordinating permits, weather windows, and team members across different countries and mountain ranges. The physical demands were extraordinary, climbing at extreme altitude with minimal rest between expeditions, his body never fully recovering before the next challenge. On October 29, 2019, just 6 months and 6 days after starting, Nimsdai stood on the summit of Shishapangma in Tibet, the 14th and final 8,000er. He had completed what many thought impossible, climbing all 14 of the world's highest peaks in under 7 months. The achievement shattered the previous record and demonstrated an almost superhuman level of endurance, determination, and high-altitude performance. But Nimsdai's accomplishment was about more than just speed. As a Nepali climber, his success brought attention to the incredible capabilities of Sherpa and other Nepali climbers, who had long been the backbone of Himalayan mountaineering. His expedition teams included other Nepali climbers, and he used his platform to advocate for better recognition and treatment of high-altitude workers. The achievement became a source of immense national pride in Nepal and helped shift the narrative about who the true elite climbers in the Himalayas were. Then came 2020, and the world changed in ways no one had anticipated. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, and suddenly, international travel ground to a halt. Climbing expeditions were cancelled. Mountains that had seen increasing numbers of visitors each year suddenly stood empty. The pandemic had a significant impact on the mountaineering community and raised questions about the future of climbing tourism. For some, the pause was a welcome respite for the mountains, a chance for the environment to recover from years of heavy use. For others, particularly those in Nepal and other regions whose economies depended heavily on climbing tourism, it was an economic disaster. As the world began to emerge from the pandemic in 2021, mountaineers were eager to return to the peaks. And in January of that year, one of mountaineering's most formidable challenges was finally overcome. A team of 10 Nepali climbers successfully reached the summit of K2 in winter, accomplishing what had been called the last great prize in mountaineering. K2 in winter had defeated every previous attempt. The mountain, already notorious as one of the most dangerous 8,000ers in good conditions, becomes almost unimaginably hostile in winter. Temperatures can plummet to -60 degrees Celsius. Winds can exceed 200 kilometers per hour. The jet stream descends to strike the upper slopes with full force. Daylight hours are severely limited. Many experienced climbers had declared a winter ascent of K2 impossible. Multiple international expeditions had tried and failed over the years. Some were turned back by weather, others by the extreme cold that made even the most advanced equipment fail. Frostbite and hypothermia threatened anyone who ventured high on the mountain. The Nepali team faced all these same challenges, but they had something else: unity of purpose and unmatched high-altitude experience. The 10 climbers were Nimsdai Purja, Mingma Gyalje Sherpa, Mingma David Sherpa, Mingma Tenzi Sherpa, Geljen Sherpa, Pemchiri Sherpa, Dawa Temba Sherpa, Dawa Tenjin Sherpa, Kili Pemba Sherpa, and Sona Sherpa. They had climbed together, supported each other through the brutal conditions, and made the decision to summit together as one team. On January 16th, 2021, all 10 reached the summit in darkness, their headlamps piercing the winter night at over 8,600 meters. They sang their national anthem at the top, their voices carried away by the wind, a moment of pure triumph in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The significance of this achievement extended beyond breaking records. This was teamwork at its finest, climbers choosing to succeed together rather than racing for individual glory. It showed that the last great challenge in mountaineering could be overcome through collaboration, skill, and determination. K2 in winter had fallen, and it had taken a unified team effort to make it happen. By 2023, technological advancements continued to enhance safety and efficiency in expeditions. New climbing equipment, improved GPS devices, and satellite communication tools made it possible for climbers to attempt routes and objectives that would have been far more dangerous in earlier eras. Weather forecasting had improved dramatically, allowing climbers to better choose their weather windows. Materials science had produced lighter and stronger ropes, warmer and more breathable clothing, more reliable tents and stoves. All of these incremental improvements added up to a significant change in what was possible. As we look at the current state of mountaineering, several trends stand out. Sustainability initiatives have become central to the climbing community. Many climbers and organizations now focus on reducing waste in the mountains, promoting leave no trace principles, and advocating for the preservation of high-altitude ecosystems. There is a growing recognition that these mountains are precious, fragile environments that deserve protection, not just playgrounds for human ambition. Ethical climbing practices have also become a major topic of discussion. The treatment of Sherpas and local communities, the environmental impact of expeditions, the role of supplemental oxygen, the use of fixed ropes and pre-placed camps. All of these issues are being debated and discussed within the climbing community. There is no consensus on all of these questions, but the conversations themselves represent a maturing of the sport, a willingness to grapple with difficult ethical issues, rather than simply pursuing summits at any cost. Social media has transformed the way climbers share their experiences and connect with one another. Instagram, YouTube, and other platforms allow climbers to document their expeditions in real time, to share stunning photographs and videos, to build audiences and even make careers from their climbing. This has made the sport more visible to a global audience than ever before. It has inspired countless people to try climbing who might never have discovered it otherwise. But it has also created new pressures, new temptations to take risks for the sake of content, new dynamics around sponsorship and self-promotion that don't always align with the traditional values of mountaineering. Recent years have seen climbers attempting and achieving record-breaking ascents. Speed climbs, where climbers try to reach a summit in the fastest possible time. First ascents of new routes on already climbed peaks. Link-ups, where climbers summit multiple peaks in a single push. The human desire to push boundaries, to do what has not been done before, continues unabated. As long as there are mountains, there will be climbers dreaming of new ways to test themselves against those mountains. And so our journey through the history of mountain exploration comes to a close. We have traveled from ancient times, when mountains were seen as sacred dwelling places of gods, through the birth of modern mountaineering with the first ascent of Mont Blanc, through the golden age of alpinism, when the great peaks of the Alps fell one by one to determine climbers. We have followed the story into the 20th century, to the Himalayas, and the race to climb the 8,000-meter peaks, culminating in the first ascent of Everest. We have seen how climbing evolved through the latter half of the 20th century and into our current era, with increasing technical difficulty, winter ascents, new ethical conversations, and changing relationships with these magnificent mountains. Through it all, certain themes have remained constant. The allure of the heights, the desire to explore, to stand in places of profound beauty and challenge, the partnerships and teamwork that make climbing possible, the risks and the tragedies, reminders that mountains demand respect and cannot be conquered, only climbed with permission from the weather and the conditions. The ongoing conversation about how we as humans should relate to these environments, how we can pursue our passion for the mountains while also preserving them for future generations. The mountains are timeless. They were here long before humans evolved, and they will be here long after we are gone. They tower into the sky, silent and magnificent, waiting for those who wish to explore them, to test themselves against their slopes, to seek that indescribable feeling that comes from standing on a summit, having given everything to get there. And whether you are a climber yourself, or simply someone who appreciates these stories from the comfort of your home, there is something profound and moving about the human relationship with mountains, about our endless fascination with these vertical places. If you're still awake, you'll shortly find another midnight exploration waiting on your screen, or you may choose a playlist to continue your journey through the night. If these stories have brought you peace, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your midnight reflections with us. Your support helps our community grow and allows us to reach other fellow explorers wishing to find their rest. The night surrounds you now, peaceful and dark and quiet. Sleep is near, or perhaps already here, drifting in and out. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. The mountains stand eternal in the darkness, their summits outlined against the stars, and you are here, safe and warm and comfortable, ready to let go fully, ready to surrender to sleep, ready to rest. May your dreams be peaceful. May you wake refreshed, and may you carry with you some small sense of the wonder and beauty of the high places, the mountains that have called to explorers throughout history and that continue to call today. Rest now, sleep well.